Hello everyone, in this video we'll be analyzing a question and response to question 8 of the 2017 ATAR English exam. The purpose of this video is to see how the concepts we have learned about in previous videos work together to help you create a solid exam response. So let's move on to the question breakdown. I think a good place to start with this question is in identifying the two texts with a similar purpose but a different genre. To find the purpose of a text, try to think of what the text is trying to teach you or persuade you to do or think. For example, the purpose of Blood Diamonds by Edward Zwick is to persuade the audience not to buy conflict diamonds and minerals. It can also be categorized as a feature film, which is its genre or form. Then we can also take a look at some other documentary. I don't know, let's call it Watch Out for Bad Diamonds. And it also has a similar purpose, to persuade the audience not to buy conflict minerals and precious gems. So by picking these two texts, we can identify their similar purpose, to persuade the audience not to buy conflict minerals and gems that are funding civil wars. And we can also identify their genres. One is a feature film, and the other is a documentary film. Now back to the question. The question is basically saying, okay, so we know that these two texts share the same purpose or the same goal, but what are the techniques that each of these texts uses to achieve that purpose? That is the thing that we need to compare. And these techniques will differ because even though both are technically film, one is a feature film or movie, and the other one is a documentary film. And movie directors use different techniques to documentary filmmakers to convey their ideas. For example, one of the ways these texts aim to educate the audience on conflict diamonds is by making the viewer have sympathy for the victims of the wars which have been funded by the people buying the diamonds. In the feature film, they may do this by using the narrative point of view of a victim in the story to show that he's not having a good day and that he's sad. In the documentary film, however, they may use sad music in an interview of the victims to also show that they're not having a good day and to make the viewer sympathize with these victims. So as you can see here, two different techniques are used for the same purpose. So now that we have a good idea of how to respond to the question, let's make sure we understand all the nuances of the question properly. Firstly, we have to make sure that the two texts we choose have a similar purpose. The key word here is similar, so they don't have to be exactly the same, but if you choose texts with vastly different purposes, then I think you need to look up what similar means in the dictionary. Also, make sure that the two texts have different genres. In ATAR English, genre can mean or refer to a genre of form or a genre of subject. So in the Blood Diamond example, the feature film and the documentary are different in terms of form because one is a feature film and the other is a documentary. But two movies such as Avengers and Die Hard 4, although they are of the same form, as in they're both movies, one is a superhero film and one is an action film. So keep the idea that text can both have a genre of form and a genre of subject as well. Then finally remember, in a comparison essay, we have to compare the text side by side. So this means that in each body paragraph, the first half of the paragraph can be saying that text A achieves this purpose using this technique, and then in the second half of the paragraph, text B achieves this purpose using this different technique. So let's have a look at a simple example. Now imagine that I've picked two texts, text A and text B. They both have a similar purpose, and this purpose is to persuade the audience that racism is bad. Now since I'm a good student and I've actually studied for English, I know that first of all, text A is a film. It shows that racism is bad through lighting, camera movement, and symbolism. And I also know that text B is a novel, and it tells the audience that racism is bad through narrative point of view, imagery, and tone. Now notice that these techniques that I've picked for each text are specific to the genre of the text. Now because text A is a film, I'm going to be looking at audio and visual techniques. And since text B is a novel, I'm going to be looking for written techniques that the author uses to convey the idea that racism is bad. So when planning my essay, I might do something like this. At the top here, my thesis is text A and B persuades the audience that racism is bad. Text A achieves this through lighting, camera movement, and symbolism. Text B achieves this through narrative point of view, imagery, and tone. Now for each of my paragraph topic sentences, you can see how I've managed to organize them according to common ideas and arguments. The first paragraph will be about how both texts show that racists are evil, which then leads to the idea that racism is not good. The second paragraph says that both texts create sympathy for the victims of racism, which makes us feel sorry for the victims and then reject racism. The last paragraph talks about how both texts show that all people are equal and that racism has no room in our society, which therefore persuades the audience to reject any racist ideologies. Now for each of our topic sentences, we're going to need some evidence to explain how each of our texts supports our argument. So I've prepared a little something for paragraph 1. In the first half of paragraph 1, we'll talk about how text A shows how the racists are portrayed to be evil. As you can read here, racist character is shown to be evil in text A through dark and sinister lighting on his face. This makes the audience think that he's not cool and therefore persuades them to reject racist views and racist people. So now that I've said how text A achieves this purpose, I go on to compare it to text B. So on the other hand, in text B, narrative point of view reveals the malevolence and evil doings of the racist character Mr. Joe to persuade the audience to reject him and his racist tendencies. So now in my plan, we can see I've compared how, as in what techniques, each text uses to persuade the audience that racism is bad. Now this is an oversimplified example, and I hope that you don't write that racism is bad in your exam, but the method I'm showing you here still applies. So let's take a look at a real example response to this question. I haven't changed the response at all, and I've only fixed some punctuation and spelling to make it a little bit more accessible. Before you read it, just understand that the writer's chosen texts are Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Egg Snatchers by Genoveva Correa, which I am not familiar with and cannot find on Google. But from the essay, I understand that it is an expository text about eugenics and gene selection in human embryos to create the exact types of humans we want. So that's just a little bit of background information in there to help you understand the essay. Alright, so let's get into the reading. Man cannot control nature. This is the same purpose that both Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Egg Snatchers by Genoveva Correa present. While both are different genres, a novel and expository text, they both disagree with man controlling nature. The clever uses of descriptive language, jargon, allegory, and rhetorical questions, intertextual references, and dialogue reveal the similar purposes that both texts have. Frankenstein, being a novel, uses descriptive language to warn readers that man cannot control nature. Correa instead uses jargon to appear as if she understands what is being said and implied. Shelley uses words such as beautiful and lustrous to describe Frankenstein's monster. The monster is made out to be this wonderful discovery, this step forward in science and in life. It paints a clear picture in the reader's head of how amazing this creation is. It mirrors how a scientist would feel about a creation of theirs, the joy and excitement. As Frankenstein realizes the horror of his creation, Shelley changes to descriptive language. It changes from beautiful and lustrous to miserable monster, horror, and demonical. This creation, once so glorified, is reduced to a monster once Frankenstein realizes the implications of what he has done. On the other hand, Correa uses jargon to achieve a professional air. Instead of striking fear into the heart of the reader as Shelley did, Correa prefers to portray herself as a trustworthy person. By using the words eugenics and embryo, Correa presents herself as someone who knows what she is talking about. Correa does not want to appear underinformed and clueless to her readers, so she uses the correct and proper terminology. The reader is more inclined to trust her and opinion because she knows more than they do. Correa lulls her readers into a sense of trust and then reveals her purpose to warn society that a man cannot control nature. Both Shelley and Correa use language features found in their genres to construct their purpose to warn society that man cannot control nature. While Shelley uses allegory to inspire questions within the reader, Correa uses rhetorical questions. Shelley brings up the debate of whether life is more than just electrical impulses or whether it is something non-material, such as a soul. The spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. The lifeless thing was never alive before. It is an assembly of organs and limbs. It begs the reader to ask themselves what the part of being really is. Is it simply electrical impulses or something more? Shelley goes on to show the reader that it is much more than an electrical impulse. Shelley carefully uses allegory to make the reader question and then provides the answer later on. This reveals the purpose of Frankenstein. Correa uses rhetorical questions instead to have the same impact. Why are we splitting the functions of motherhood into smaller parts? This rhetorical question would resonate strongly with mothers. No mother wants her role to be diminished and forgotten. Correa plays on those fears by asking rhetorical questions like that. Correa encourages her readers to question eugenics so that when she critiques it, there is a higher chance of her readers agreeing with her. Correa uses rhetorical questions, a language feature that is commonly found in a genre of expository texts, to construct an argument and purpose to warn society that man cannot control nature. Shelley makes an intertextual reference that helps her readers to picture the consequences of man controlling nature, while Correa uses dialogue to demonize the biologist. If the descriptive language Shelley used did not help the reader to fully understand the consequences of man controlling nature, her intertextual reference would. It became a thing, such as even Dante could not have conceived. Dante is famous for his book Dante's Inferno, which described the 9 circles of hell. Shelley is referring to the 7th circle of hell, which is where all manner of monsters originates from, more evil and ugly than the mind can imagine. Shelley's intertextual reference shows just how bad Frankenstein's monster is, and that it is the consequence of man trying to control nature. Correa uses direct and indirect dialogue to demonize those who are for eugenics and the biologist she is talking to. Correa would use indirect dialogue about embryo supermarkets to appear in the future. Straight after, Correa would use direct dialogue of the biologist saying, "Once people change their views about eugenics." Correa cleverly employs this language feature to position the biologist as if he agrees with embryo supermarkets. The dialogue may have been taken out of context, and the biologist may not have been talking about embryo supermarkets. While Shelley demonizes the consequences of man trying to control nature, Correa demonizes people who try to do it. While their methods of constructing a similar purposes are different due to their genres, their purposes remain similar. Shelley and Correa both effectively use language conventions specific to their genre to reveal their purpose of warning society that man cannot control nature. Shelley implements descriptive language, allegory, and intertextual references to construct a purpose, and demonizes the consequences. Correa chooses to use rhetorical questions, jargon, and dialogue to demonize those who attempt to control nature. I hope that you managed to follow along and that you picked out some points of interest from the response. In order to improve our writing skills, I think it's always a good idea to identify aspects of the response that we liked so that we can copy those techniques and apply them to our own writing. It is also a good idea to identify aspects that we didn't like as much so that we can learn to avoid making the same mistakes in the future. This is exactly what I have done, which I have organized into a list of pros and cons about the response to share with you. Looking at the pros, I think that the response answered and addressed all aspects of the question. I like the fact that they identified and compared the generic conventions really well and chose techniques specific to each genre. And I also like the way they structured their response, which is how you should be structuring a comparative essay by comparing the 2 texts in every single paragraph. Now, what I didn't like about the essay is first of all the thesis. I think that it's too broad and vague. I think that making it more specific will help your readers understand more clearly what the purposes of the 2 texts are and helps to bring into context what the 2 texts are about. Also, the writer of this response didn't really have any topic sentences, so although the writer has compared both texts in each paragraph, there isn't some overarching idea or argument that groups the elements in each paragraph together, except for saying that Frankenstein achieves the purpose using this technique, and Egg Nappers achieves the purpose using this other technique. I also think that the writer could improve the clarity of the explanations a little bit more so that readers who are unfamiliar with the text could better understand what the texts are about or what specific point they were trying to make. For example, in the second paragraph, when the writer mentioned that Shelley uses an allegory in Frankenstein, he or she didn't actually explain what the allegory was. They only mentioned that an allegory was used to show that controlling nature is bad in Frankenstein. I think they should have explained what the allegory was and how exactly it contributed to the purpose, which is to disagree with the idea of man controlling nature. This also links into the final point, which is the lack of contextual information in the introduction. Although the text and their creators were mentioned, I think it is a good idea to also talk about the subject and overarching ideas presented in the text, without retelling the story. I think that including this information in the introduction would really help with the quality and strength of the response, and will allow the writer to improve the clarity of their writing. A well-structured essay can actually be broken down into its component parts, or in other words, back into the plan. Here is my interpretation of the response broken down into a plan. It starts with the thesis at the top, leading into 3 topic sentences but not really topic sentences, which represents each paragraph. Each paragraph then leads into a comparison between the 2 texts, which is the right way to structure a comparison essay. Notice how in each bit of evidence and explanation, I've highlighted the specific technique in bold letters to show how the writer has introduced a specific generic technique to support their thesis, which answers the different genres part of the question. Note how the paragraphs are not structured around common arguments or ideas to support the thesis, but instead just introduces the different ways the 2 texts support the thesis. It's not absolutely necessary to structure your paragraphs around common arguments or ideas, but doing so strengthens your response and will therefore net you more marks. I've also included in this plan my own interpretation of the evidence and explanations to make it clearer for readers to understand this response. For example, in paragraph 2, when the writer mentioned that Mary Shelley uses an allegory, I think that he or she should have explained it in this way: that the story of Frankenstein and his monster is an allegory of the origin of life from the book of Genesis, which is from the Christian Bible. Now, Frankenstein is a creator like God. He created his monster, hence Frankenstein's monster, whereas God created Adam and Eve. However, in Frankenstein's case, his monster is a bit of a monster and did not turn out well for everyone involved, whereas in the book of Genesis, God actually succeeded in creating something beautiful such as humans, animals, and life in general. So by comparing these two parallel stories, Shelley is basically saying that humans shouldn't try to play God and create life, because if we do, we're not going to do a good job or as good of a job as God did with creating life. Therefore, we should not attempt to control nature. Take your time to have a look through the entire plan and pause the video if you would like to copy the template down. If you're looking for some extra English study, see if you can rewrite and improve one of the paragraphs in this response using the information from this plan. You could also try using this plan template to prepare an essay of your own. Also keep in mind what this writer did well and what they could improve on, and try to incorporate those aspects into your own essay responses. So to conclude, here are the main ways in which I would improve this response. Firstly, I think a clearer and more specific thesis would help. For example, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Egg Snatchers by Genoveva Correa use generic conventions such as X, Y, and Z to warn readers not to trifle with the natural processes associated with the creation of life. My second point is to make sure that the paragraphs contain some central idea or argument and is expressed in the topic sentence. For example, Shelley and Correa use descriptive language and technical jargon to show the horrific consequences in creating or altering life. Third is to improve on the quality of the explanations in your body paragraphs. Remember, you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for someone else's reading pleasure. So always make sure you explain or express yourself concisely so the reader knows exactly what you're talking about. The idea of the response is to answer a question, not to raise more questions once we've read your essay. Lastly, is to make sure the introduction actually introduces your text so that we understand the contextual information and ideas represented in the text you have studied and in your essay. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this helpful. In the next video, I'll be showing you my thought processes in planning and writing an essay so we can see how I approach a question from first reading the question to planning and writing, and finally when proofreading. That will be the final video for section 2, and in the video after that, we'll be heading into section 1. I'll see you then.